Okay, I think it's on, yes. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see that so many of you are here today. I thought it's around lunchtime, so I was preparing for maybe 5, 6 people to be here, so it's good to see you. My name is Sara. I'm the CEO and the co-founder of Midnight Hub, an indie studio based here in Malmö. And today I will be talking about my journey with Midnight Hub and how we released the indie game Lake Ridden. And I want this presentation to be a case study for what it's like to release a game on Steam, what it's like to release a game that gets tons of good press that most indie studios can only dream about, and then having to disband the team and let everybody go just a few months after the release to avoid closing down the whole studio. So it's going to be quite the emotional journey, and yeah, I hope you learn something from this. And speaking about learning, conferences like these are an amazing opportunity to get together and learn from each other. And I really like to contribute to that today. But I feel like quite often we just talk about success stories. And I think there is a value in also talking about struggles and hardship, and sometimes think about how we define failure. So, while Googling for motivational quotes to insert into this talk, this is something that I found along the way that I think actually makes sense. I've seen so many motivational talks by now that I just want to puke on all of them. Well, so this industry and our market can be quite a stressful place at times. And if you stay in it for long enough, you will most likely experience at least one cancelled project or a layoff or perhaps even a bankruptcy. I think maybe some of you out there have the experience of being a dream team working together, and then one day perhaps your publisher or your manager comes in and they say, we canceled the project, let's move on. I have friends that have been working in this studio, making games, getting up on stage to accept awards, and just a few weeks later having to cancel the whole studio. So how do you bounce back from experiences like this? How do you keep on moving? And I'm not saying that I have all the answers, but I would like to share my perspective with you today. So let's start from the beginning. I started out in the games industry in 2009 and have since then been lucky enough to work as a manager, a producer, a data analyst, and most recently a CEO at Midnight Hub. And I'm currently a producer for an amazing team at Massive Ubisoft, but I'm not here today to talk about Massive. A fun fact is that this year's Nordic Game Conference marks my 10th one. I've been lucky enough to attend Nordic Game Conference for 10 years by now. And it's my favorite conference. And I'm not saying that because I live here in Malmö and will have the luxury of sleeping in my own bed every night of this conference. But I think that this conference, the Nordic Game Conference, is one of the few conferences that actually sees the value in also talking about struggles. And I like to think that just the fact that my talk about struggle and hardship is placed in this, the biggest room, can be a sign of how much they value those kinds of stories as well. So, just to give you some background, Midnight Hub was founded in 2015 by me and my friends Eric and Johan. I know they are in the audience today, so thank you for coming here. And at the time, Eric worked at Paradox, Johan worked at Minecraft, and I had been working as an independent consultant for the past 2 years with various game studios. But I really started to feel like I wanted to be part of a closely knit team again. So one late summer night, after having maybe a couple of too many drinks at a traditional Swedish crayfish party, I called Johan and I said we should start a studio together. He's hands down one of the absolute best programmers I have ever worked with. So Johan and I, we started to look for an art director to found the studio together with, and we approached my friend Eric, who is a very talented artist. And some weeks later, we did a small game jam together just over a weekend, and we picked 2 cards from Cards Against Humanity. I don't know if you played that game, but you get like random themes, which are usually quite horrible. And we made a game just based upon those 2 cards. And I think the theme was something like underwater tigers or something like that. And the point of the game jam was not to make the perfect game, but it was to have a reality check to see how do we work together, even under slight pressure. Those of you that done game jams know that there's still just 48 hours to do something together. Also to find out like what was the chemistry, how did we communicate, what did it feel like? And I can't say that the game became the best game ever made, but it really showed us that we enjoyed spending time together, and it felt like our creative energies complemented each other. So we spent some additional months researching, budgeting, talking about all kinds of scenarios for how to run a company. And at the end of 2015, we opened up Midnight Hub here in Malmö. Johan, as he was our creative director, coder, and designer, and Eric was the art director, and I became the CEO, producer, and the studio manager. So, our long-term goal was to build an indie studio. Our goal was not only to make a game, we actually wanted to create a sustainable studio. And this image over here, it's something that we had at the studio. It's like the wall of fame. So every time somebody did something outstanding, or you could tell that somebody put a big effort into something, we actually wrote that down on a post-it and handed it over to the person, sometimes with a gold or silver star, just to make them remember not only the big victories, but the small victories as well. So we wanted to create a sustainable studio that made interesting, ambitious indie games without a main focus on violence as the gameplay. And Johan, Eric, and I, we analyzed the strengths in the team and also what motivated us. And then we created pitches. Everybody created pitches for the games they would like to make. We pitched them to each other, and then we decided on what would eventually become Lake Ridden. And when we announced the game, it was a horror game filled with puzzles, mystery, and you play as Marie, 14-year-old, searching for her sister who has vanished in the forest during a camping trip. And those of you that are familiar with Lake Ridden from before will know that the game eventually released as a first-person puzzler, not a story game. And that's because a year after we announced the game, the horror game market had changed a lot, and we made a conscious but hard decision to pivot and remove the horror part from the game. If you have a startup, you need to pivot at least once. So the game basically, I would describe it maybe as a mix between Myst, the old Myst game, if you've played that one, a lot of puzzles, a mix between Myst and maybe Firewatch. So we're more accessible than Myst and maybe not quite as story heavily reliant as Firewatch is. So development ensued, and we started to gain momentum. We secured a big investment. We managed to expand the team from just being 3 to being 7. We got accepted into one of the best business incubators in the whole of Europe. And after GDC 2017, our tiny indie game was front page on Polygon with the early gameplay video. And I continued to exhibit our demo at places like EGX in England, where almost 2,000 people played our game over those 4 days, which was amazing. And after that conference, something like 30 journalists mentioned the game when they wrote about the conference. And we managed to gain the attention of outlets like PC Gamer, Kotaku, Rock Paper Shotgun, EGN picked up on our trailers. I was nominated as Rookie of the Year in a business gala here in Sweden. And Lake Ridden was also chosen to be one of the representatives for the European Games Showcase in San Francisco in 2018. So that's not too bad for a small indie studio doing everything themselves. And so far, I've talked a lot about the game, but like I said, the goal was always to establish a successful studio. So let's have a look at some of the stuff that we managed to create in the actual studio. And our vision was always to create a studio that did not rely on crunch to ship good quality games. So we introduced a stress rating system to help us battle stress. And at the end of each sprint, we all sat together when we closed the sprint, and each team member could rate their own stress levels on a scale from 1 to 5, and we documented those numbers. And by doing that, you can if you're good enough, you can see a trend. And when you get numbers on stress, it becomes way harder to just okay, but next week we'll be less stressed. You have numbers, it's hard to look away if somebody's reporting a 4 or a 5 a couple of weeks in a row. And in true game dev fashion, we used Scrum-ish to keep track of velocity, and we documented, of course, how many story points we managed to churn each week. And then when we established an average for the whole team, we wanted to experiment with maybe lowering the amount of time that we spent at the office. So we actually went from 40 our work weeks to 35, and we said, let's just try it out first and see what happens. But the interesting thing for us was that we actually stayed the same on the velocity. So the team still churned through the same amount of points, even though we spent less time at the office. And the stress levels did not spike. People didn't feel all right, I have 1 hour less every day to do my stuff, so I need to squeeze it in until the hours I have. So that was an interesting experiment that we did, and we encouraged all of the team members to instead do stuff that gave them energy, like going to the gym or picking up your kids a bit earlier from the daycare. And just things like having a 35-hour work week or having a no crunch policy, those are also good selling points when you want to recruit. So it's about doing the good thing, but also maybe it's an advantage for your studio. So I'm super proud to say that when we released the game in the spring of 2018, we did so without crunch. And shipping a game that scores a 90% positive for user rating on Steam without crunch is something that I, as the producer, will always see as a tremendous achievement. And don't get me wrong, because when you have your own company, even though you're not in the office, you are constantly thinking about the game. It's the first thing that you think about when you wake up, and it's probably the last thing that you think about before you fall asleep at night. So when we went to parties, Eric, Johan, and I, we sometimes ended up being in a corner, speaking to each other, making plans for the game or for the studio instead of mingling with other people. So there's a big difference in constantly thinking about your own company or your game versus spending 50 or 60 hours in the office. So we tried to do our best to establish a company culture where we worked smarter, not harder. And at one point, we had a lot of coins in the office, and when we started the sprint, each member got to distribute their number of coins on their tasks, and this way it becomes quite clear to the whole team if you ask somebody to do something that they don't have time to do. So it really helped us prioritize our efforts and to focus our energy on the features that we needed the most. And in May 2018, almost exactly a year ago, we finally shipped Lake Ridden for PC on Steam, GOG, and Humble. And it was a very ambitious project. Almost nobody that I talked with that's a game developer believed that we have shipped this game with just 2 programmers, 2 artists, 2 composers, and 1 producer. Especially when you include the huge change of direction that we had to make along the way. And you have to understand that most projects that have this kind of change of direction, they are never released. The project either fall apart or the people quit the project. And our initial launch actually went beyond all our expectations. Our long-time marketing plan had always been to hit the front page on Steam and stay there for as long as we could, making the game visible for as many gamers as possible. And we figured out that would probably be enough to snowball sales into motion. And we did manage to get to the front page of Steam, both on this, the tiny chart shown here, but also in the main big slider. So I had friends tweeting me from countries saying like, "Oh, I saw your game on Steam," and that was amazing. And we're speaking countries like UK, USA, all the Nordic countries, Germany, front page. And since you all know that our team was forced to disband just 3 months later, I want to share with you when I said that we had a successful launch, because I know it can sound a bit paradoxical, if that's a word. So here are some of the stuff that we managed to achieve. We were 5 days on the Steam front page in USA, UK, Nordics, other countries. We worked with 2 big PR companies at the time of launch. We sent out 2,500 keys to legit streamers. Most of them actually requested a key from us on Keymailer. I think we're like one of their success story cases that they show to people. We had big streamers that picked up us that we did not reach out to. We exhibited at EGX, GDC, Nordic Game Conference, Swedish Game Conference, not once, but sometimes twice, and had a lot of token cards dealt out to people that actually tried the game. We were covered by many of the biggest outlets out there, and Johan had his Twitter account from his time at Mojang with 400,000 followers, where we continuously tweeted about the game for 2.5 years. And on top of that, we had viral GIFs and big industry names that gave us shout-outs. And my personal favorite PR moment was when we got chosen to meet the King of Sweden. That was awesome. So, was it a huge success then? Well, like I mentioned before, the game released with a 90% positive rating on Steam. And during the first weeks around the release, we sold some 1,000 copies, and that was about it. And I could not believe the numbers. And during a couple of days following the release, I was genuinely confused and just waited for Steam to update and show us the real numbers. And Summer Sale came around the corner and sold us a few extra copies in July, but that was kind of it. It's supposed to be black. Ever since the beginning of 2018, we had prepared for a worst-case scenario just in case Lake Ridden did not sell as we expected it to do. And we knew that sometimes you have the best product and you're releasing the first thing from your startup and it's just not selling because there could be a competitor hitting the market at the same time, or it could be bad timing or some rules changing, or sometimes there is not even a clear reason. And we wanted to make sure that the fantastic team that we had built for the past 3 years would not have to just disband. And with a score of 90% on Steam, we had proven that we were able to build and ship solid games. But in the end, almost none of those leads that we tried to follow up came true. And on my first day of vacation in July, I had to call all of our employees and tell them that we had to let everybody go in order to save the studio from bankruptcy. And making that call is probably one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it's also the only responsible thing to do at this point. And when the summer was over, nobody was employed by Midnight Hub anymore. And as a last attempt, we exhibited the game at EGX in Birmingham in September, but even if the audience once again lined up to play our game and talk to us and take or merge. It was not enough. I think maybe in the end we sold like 25 or 40 copies because of that. 25. And October came around the corner, and by then Erik, Johan, and I were looking for new jobs. And if you are familiar with the 5 stages of grief, you probably know that they have been disproved by science by now, but I find them very helpful for thinking about the time that followed the launch. And the first stage of grief is said to be denial. We refused to believe that the numbers were true when the data started to come in from GOG and Steam around launch. Despite everything that we had done, we did not initially manage to sell even more copies than I personally had Twitter followers, which was around 3,000 at this time. It just didn't make any sense to us. And I attended the Nordic Game Conference around this time last year, just 2 weeks after the release, leaving parties every now and then to just go onto Steam and check our numbers, just waiting for those true numbers to finally start coming in. And I was just so convinced that there must have been some kind of mistake somewhere, but the numbers did not lie. And we hosted an amazing release party on a rooftop a few weeks later after that in June, and everybody were congratulating us because they've seen the game on top of Steam, and they've seen all of the marketing and the PR we have done, and they thought that must have been worth maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of sold copies for this indie game. And I personally was just feeling like the world was crumbling around me. And the next step is anger. And this is kind of hard to talk about for me. But the ugly truth is that during this time, I just could not be happy for other indie studios or other developers releasing amazing games. I tried, but I just couldn't be that. So often I visited their parties. I was there for a couple of hours, and then I left, going home, just staring at our own numbers on Steam instead. And after anger comes bargaining, and we followed up on all our last chances, all our last opportunities, but nothing of that came true. And like I mentioned before, we worked really hard since the New Year's just to have a backup plan, but things were what they were. Depression is said to be the stage after bargaining, stage number 4. And in September, we cleaned out our offices, and I was heartbroken. I was the last person to leave the office, to lock the doors and hand the keys over to our landlord. Midnight Hub as a company technically existed still at this point, but we were all looking for new jobs, and the team had parted ways. Johan, Erik, and I did our best to not only help each other, but also our 2 fantastic employees to find new jobs. And for the longest of time, it has been extremely hard for me to think about Lake Ridden without feeling an immense sorrow coming over me. At the release, I did interviews. I talked about our game and our adventure in different kind of podcasts and radio, that kind of stuff, but I just felt empty for days. How was it possible for a game to have such a good launch, to have all of this traction, to release and get 9 out of 10 with user ratings on Steam, and then having to find yourself looking for a new job just months later? We had invested everything in this. I had invested all of my savings and all of my energy into trying to make this work. And looking back, I think for me it's hard to see how I would have managed without the support from my fantastic co-founders and also my closest friends and family. And I kind of started to think about myself as worthless during this time. And I wrote a post-mortem of Lake Ridden, where we analyzed and discussed different theories about how could the sales numbers have been so low. And I just want to emphasize that we will probably not ever be able to test these theories, but it was a good exercise, and I'm happy that the Post-Mortem went viral and so many people have seemed to be able to find it useful. I will link to it in my Twitter, so you can find it, or you can just Google or go to our webpage. Maybe it was that May was the wrong month to be releasing a game about autumn, or maybe it could be that our core audience still thought that we were a horror game when we released, and they got put off by that. Or maybe it could be that first-person, single-player, story-driven stories was not really that in 2018. Or maybe we should have gone with the publisher instead. And personally, I think that the truth might be that there was a mix of bad timing and changing markets, because when we founded the studio in 2015, Steam was very different from what it is now. It still had, the green light process, and you had to vote for games to be allowed to be released on Steam. And that was also a way for you to start building your community. So Steam Greenlight as a process was removed in 2017, about exactly a year before we released the game. We did purchase the Greenlight entry 2 days before it was cancelled, but we got a refund for that, so that's good. And today, if you look at Steam, I'm sorry, but I don't have the numbers for 2019. Somebody else might have those, but around 1 game per hour is released at Steam right now, and I think that the average number of games that a user on Steam buys is like 8, and that includes everything, like the latest AAA games, your little indie game, as games that were released 5 years ago that you have to compete with. And a lot of those customers expect to buy their games on huge discounts as well. So we did get a lot of wish lists, and that's awesome. But I think most of those wish listers are waiting perhaps to buy the game when it's on a big discount. And don't get me wrong, because I am so happy that a lot of people can release their games on Steam, and that more players than ever can find games on Steam that they feel like playing. So don't get me wrong. And the final stage is acceptance. When I was invited by Jacob and his crew to do this talk at Nordic Game Conference, I hesitated. I did this for many reasons, and I was still very much in the depressive state of sorrow, and I didn't want to give like a depressing, gloomy talk about how the indie apocalypse is happening. And I thought, like, what was even the point of getting up here and to talk about this? Was there something to learn? Was there a lesson? But I I signed up and just hoped that would push me into the realm of acceptance instead. And while preparing for this talk, I posted on Twitter searching for a new perspective on the struggle. And I guess that this kind of triggered something in me, and I started to realize how much we had actually achieved. That to release any game is a huge achievement. A game that sits on a 9 out of 10 positive rating on Steam, with the occasional hater. A game that is loved by those who manage to find it. And Erik, Johan and I have grown from colleagues to the closest of friends, being there for each other through all of this. And you have to understand that when a company struggles like ours did, that usually ends up burning friendships to the ground. But not in this case. And we actually did it. We did take a big risk. We did quit our jobs to do something completely new in hopes of creating something that could be bigger than any of us would have been able to create on our own. And doing that is super rare. Most people never get around to do so, or they can't afford to do it, or they don't have the savings to do it, or they have the family to take care about. And the reality is that most game companies, they don't make it. Most games never get released. Games kind of hate getting made. And I think that most of you sitting here today can testify to that. That sooner or later you get that unannounced project which you were so passionate to work on. You get it into your CV. Or perhaps you're part of a studio closing down, or a project being cancelled. And like I said, the last stage of grief is acceptance. But we have not given up, which makes me a bit unsure if we are actually in the realm of acceptance. So I'm super happy to share with you today that Lake Ridden is heading for Xbox. I can't promise a date, but the port has already come a long way. And we've been lucky enough, despite everything that happened, to actually never close down the studio. Technically, it still exists. So we never had to pull the game from Steam. And it's been very nice to have weekends and nights to be able to work on the game. I just don't feel like giving up on a game that still sits on a 9 out of 10 positive rating on Steam. I want to give players one last chance to discover our game. And I think it's a bit of a paradox, but by sharing struggles like these and hardships with each other, I think that we can grow stronger. And I'm hoping that today, by sharing my journey with you, you will feel less alone if you have to go through the same thing like I did, or when you are working on that dream team project and your publisher comes to you and like, sorry, we're gonna pull the plug. It's not gonna be easy, but you can get through it. So maybe this could give you the strength that you need to not give up and to discover new horizons instead. And if you've been paying attention throughout my talk, you probably noticed that I never used the word failure. And that's because I think that something becomes a failure only when you can't learn from it or when you give up. Thank you. I think we got some time for questions. Otherwise, you can just come and talk to me afterwards. I'll be at the whole conference until it closes today. So if there are any questions, now is the time. Okay, then I would like to finish with a joke from Clint Eastwood, and that is, why did the game developer walk across the room? Because they were heading for the beers. That's where I will be. Thank you.